Welcome back, Prep 4. We are currently halfway through Chapter 5 of Friend or Foe. If you are following it on at home, we are about halfway down page 78. So Davy and Tucky have just encountered the Germans. They've got back to the cottage with Anne and Mr. Reynolds, and they need to make the decision of if they are going to tell Anne and Mr. Reynolds. Tucky doesn't want to tell them. We ended the last chapter, he said a little spiel about making up that Davy had fallen into the river and Tucky had pulled him out. David's not too sure. Let's see what happens. Anne put an arm around his shoulder. Are you all right, Davy? You look as if you've seen a ghost. Are you cold still? Yes, I'm cold, was all he could say. There was a steaming hot bath and tea in the kitchen, and then Anne went off to help Mr. Reynolds with the milking. It was the first time the boys had been left alone, the first chance they had had to talk. David didn't waste any time. We agreed. We said we'd tell them. We must tell them. I never agreed anything, said Tucky, ready for him. You tell them if you like, but I can tell you, if someone had just risked his own life to save mine, I wouldn't kick him in the teeth. German or not, it doesn't matter. But we can't, Tucky. We can't help Germans to escape. It's not right. We're supposed to be fighting them. We can't. Like I say, Tucky said firmly, you owe them. And what's more, you know you do. All he's asking is for some food and blankets. If you don't think that's a fair exchange for saving your life, then I think it's a pity he went in after you. David never heard Tucky talk like this. He was excitable, yes, but he'd never found him determined or single-minded. Tucky leaned towards him over the kitchen table. I like you, Davy. We've been best friends ever since I can remember. You always seem to do right by people. You've done right by me, been a real friend since we left home, but if you turn those Germans in just because your father... My father? That's what it is, Davy, isn't it? And maybe Anne's father as well. They're Germans, and the Germans killed your dad, so you hate them all, don't you? Every single one of them. There was not a single word Tucky had spoken that David could argue with. Tucky was right. He did owe the Germans out on them all. All right, he conceded. We'll do it, but not for long. Tucky smiled like his old self for the first time since they'd got back. They didn't see Mr. Reynolds again that evening. He was busy fencing at the bottom of Front Meadow. But next morning over breakfast, before David and Tucky left for school, he heard all about their search on the moor. So you found nothing? He smiled wryly. And David here fell in the river. I slipped, Mr. Reynolds. Those stones were all slimy. You crossed at the stepping stones, like I said? Yes, Mr. Reynolds. No sign of that plane? Nothing, said Tucky. We must have made a mistake. Perhaps it went up again behind a hill or something, and we just didn't see it. Sorry, Mr. Reynolds. Never you mind, my dear. You were right to tell us if you thought you saw it. Everyone makes mistakes, and anyway, 'twas good practice for the army and for us, even if no one enjoyed it very much. We won't mention it again. Off you go now. You'll be late for school. School was still buzzing with the towny shot-down German bomber, and David and Tucky longed to blurt out their secret. Haven't you found it yet, Davy boy? And look out, the Luftwaffe's about. And whenever Mr. Cooper wanted someone with a good imagination, he turned to townies with a knowing smile, and everyone laughed. It was a wretched day, only made bearable by the knowledge that they knew they were right. On the way back home that afternoon, they worked out their plan. Whatever happens, Mr. Reynolds and Anne must never find out. Never, said David. Nothing must be missed. What about blankets? They'll miss those, won't they? They're bound to. Not if we take 2 off our bed, said David. We make our own beds, don't we? No one will miss them except us. We can bring them back after they've gone. No one need notice. What about the food then? There's eggs. David had thought it all out. We can get them from the chicken hut soon as we get back. Then there's carrots and radishes in the vegetable patch. I've seen Anne pulling them up often enough. I know where they are. That won't be enough. Then there's that bowl of bread and leftovers that Anne keeps on the window ledge above the sink. We could take that, some of it anyway. No one would miss that, except, well, the pigs, of course. David had been planning it all day, and once they got home, he knew exactly what had to be done. He sent Tucky upstairs for the blankets while he went out for the food. As he expected, Anne was out with Mr. Reynolds haymaking across the stream by Long Close. It was far enough away from the house for it to be safe. They wrapped the food in one of the blankets and made off out of the back door and across the fields towards the moors. Once off the farm, they kept to the cover of the hedgerows until they reached the open moor and were out of sight of the cottage. Tucky flopped down behind a stone wall and waited for David to join him. He fought to catch his breath, hanging his head and taking in great gulps of air. David slumped down next to him and checked that the food was still inside the blankets. One egg had broken, but everything was there. It was then they upped the track behind them. They looked at each other in alarm. The panting was close now, just the other side of the stone wall. They froze against it, rigid and frightened. And then Jip came lolloping into sight, saw them cowering there and trotted over, tail wagging, tongue hanging down from his pink and grinning mouth. They laughed themselves silly with relief. Dogs can't tell tales, David said, and Jip followed them along over the hills to where the river tumbled over the rocks. They crossed over the stepping stones and clambered on up, always looking ahead of them to see if the Germans were still there. They approached the place slowly, but Jip ran on ahead, sniffing the ground busily, alternating growling and yapping in excitement. He disappeared behind a stone wall, and then there was silence. The German airmen were where they had left them, only closer in among the rocks. One of them held Jip under his arm, his hand clamped over his muzzle. Both wore their blue greatcoats and were crouching down low. Their faces relaxed, and the black revolver that was pointing at the boys was lowered. "Is it your dog?" he asked. David nodded, and the Germans released Jip and patted his neck gently. Jip sprang away and cowered behind the boys. "Food! Have you brought food?" David handed over the blanket, and the two Germans spread it out carefully in front of them. They divided it equally and then devoured it like starved dogs, looking up from time to time as if someone might take it away from them. Just a quick illustration here. The boys looked on in silence, wondering how anyone could be that hungry. They ate anything and everything: meat fat, cold porridge, stale bread, peelings, carrots, raw eggs. When they had finished, not a crumb was left on the blanket, except the eggshells. They sat back against the wall, breathing deeply. "That was good, very good," the airman was panting. "Gert here, he slept hardly at all. It will be good for him. You are kind, very kind. Thank you." It was a feast. It was a real feast. The boys saw that the men had built themselves a rough shelter up against the wall since the day before. It was made of wooden supports and covered in bracken, dried grass and freshly cut turf. There was more bracken on the floor inside and enough room for both men to squeeze in together. "It's not a palace, my young friend," he said, "but it is better than nothing." The German smiled quietly as he spoke, but then his face altered suddenly. They all heard it together, the drone of an aeroplane, and it was coming closer all the time. The two Germans crawled in under the shelter and pulled the blankets in after them. Tucky spotted it first as it came over the hill, a single-engined spotter plane, a biplane, and it flew down towards them over the moor, its RAF markings plainly visible. It was the same spotter plane that had been used in the search the week before.